The valley floor had not seen rain in 7 years. Elias knelt in the center of the expanse, his knees pressing into ground, so dry it cracked under his weight like brittle glass. Silence hung over the valley, heavy and absolute. The village houses stood as hollow shells, roofs collapsed, windows staring out like sightless eyes. Nothing moved. Not a bird, not a blade of grass. Elias opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a single withered seed. It was gray, shriveled, and light as a speck of ash. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the jagged edges of its shell. This was the last of the storehouse. He pressed his fingers into the earth, but the ground refused to yield, resisting his touch with the hardness of stone. He shifted his weight, searching for a softer patch, but found only dust. The wind picked up, a low whistle that carried the scent of parched minerals. He held the seed tighter, shielding it from the grit that scoured the air. He looked toward the mountains, but the horizon offered no relief. He looked back down at the dirt. The time for waiting had passed. Elias scanned the ground, looking for a spot where the sun hit the earth with the least intensity. He found it near the shadow of a collapsed wall. He dropped to his knees, his hands moving with deliberate, measured precision. The surface was packed hard, baked into a solid, impenetrable layer. He picked up a jagged shard of slate from the debris and began to scrape. The stones screeched against the ground, throwing up a fine, choking cloud of dust that coated his throat. He coughed, shielding his face with his forearm, and kept digging. He worked until his knuckles were raw and the skin on his palms cracked. Inch by inch, he carved a shallow depression into the parched soil. It was barely deep enough to hold the seed, but it was enough. He reached into his palm, his fingers trembling slightly as he lowered the withered grain into the dark, cool hollow. He did not rush. He took a handful of loose, fine dust and sprinkled it over the seed, patting it down with the flat of his hand. He sat back on his heels, his chest heaving with the effort. He stared at the patch of dust, his eyes unblinking, waiting for the earth to acknowledge what he had done. Elias stood, his joints popping in the stillness. The mountain spring was miles away, a thin, unreliable thread of moisture hidden in the high crags. He picked up the heavy iron bucket, the handle biting into his calloused palm. Every step toward the foothills was a negotiation with gravity. His legs felt like leaden weights, dragging through the loose, shifting scree of the valley floor. The sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering wall of heat. He reached the base of the ascent, where the path narrowed into a jagged, unstable trail. He moved with agonizing slowness, eyes locked on the waterline. He crested the final ridge, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that burned his lungs. The spring was a mere trickle, weeping from the rock face. He knelt, dipping the bucket into the basin, waiting for the slow, rhythmic drip to fill the bottom. He did not drink. He did not splash his face. He stood, his shoulders screaming under the weight, and began the long descent. He walked with his knees bent, absorbing the shock of every uneven stone. He reached the patch of dust, knelt, and tilted the bucket. He poured only a few drops, watching the liquid vanish instantly into the parched ground. The days bled into one another, marked only by the slow arc of the sun and the shifting shadows of the valley walls. Elias did not leave the patch of earth. He moved his meager belongings to the edge of the site, establishing a permanent, silent vigil. The wind was a constant, abrasive presence, carrying grit that scoured the landscape and threatened to uncover the buried seed. Whenever the gusts picked up, Elias leaned forward, spreading his body over the spot to break the force of the gale. He felt the impact of the sand against his back, a persistent, stinging rhythm that lasted for hours. He ignored the thirst that clawed at his throat. His eyes remained fixed on the dust, searching for a fracture, a change, any sign of life. The sky remained a relentless, empty blue. He sat motionless as the heat peaked, shielding the ground with his own shadow. When the evening chill descended, he pulled his limbs tighter. He was a statue of endurance, his focus narrowing until the entire world existed only within the few inches of dirt beneath him. Every hour was a test of resolve. The morning light hit the valley floor at a sharp, low angle. Elias blinked, his eyes stinging from the grit of the previous night. He looked down at the patch of earth he had guarded for weeks. A tiny, pale green sliver had pierced the surface crust. It was barely a hair's width, a fragile needle of life against the vast, dead expanse of the valley. Elias did not move. He did not reach out. His fingers twitched, itching to brush away the loose dust clinging to the stem, but he forced his hands to remain flat against his thighs. He knew the slightest pressure could crush the delicate tissue. The sun began to climb, and the temperature rose with brutal speed. He watched the sprout wilt slightly under the direct glare. He stood up, his knees popping, and scanned the immediate area for a solution. He found a flat, jagged piece of shale nearby. He picked it up, testing its weight, and returned to the site. He knelt again, moving with agonizing precision. He propped the stone against a small mound of dirt, angling it so that it cast a long, cooling shadow over the green sliver. He did not cheer, he simply watched. The air changed without warning. The heat vanished, replaced by a sudden, biting chill that swept down from the mountain peaks. Elias looked up. The horizon, once a clear and empty blue, was now choked by a wall of churning ochre dust. It moved with terrifying speed, erasing the valley walls and swallowing the light. He scrambled to his feet, his gaze darting to the tiny green sliver. The stone he had placed was already vibrating under the first heavy gusts. He knew the shale would be tossed aside like a leaf, leaving the sprout exposed to the scouring grit. There was no time to build a wall or dig a deeper trench. He dropped to his knees, positioning himself directly over the small patch of earth. He curled his torso inward, pulling his knees toward his chest to create a protective dome. The wind hit him like a physical blow, a roar that drowned out all other sound. Sand began to lash against his back, stinging like 1,000 needles. He tightened his muscles, bracing his spine against the onslaught. He was the only thing standing between the sprout and the destruction of the valley. The roar faded into a low, hollow whistle, then stopped entirely. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Elias remained curled for a long moment, his lungs burning from the dust he had inhaled. He shifted, and the sound of grit sliding off his back was like dry rain. He pushed himself upright, his muscles screaming in protest. Every movement sent a fresh wave of stinging pain across his shoulders and back. He stood on shaky legs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He scanned the ground. The area around him was unrecognizable, buried under a thick, shifting blanket of fine gray sand. He knelt back down, his hands trembling as he began to clear the debris. He moved with agonizing slowness, brushing the sand away. There, in the center of the cleared patch, the tiny green stem remained. It was bent at a sharp angle, leaning heavily toward the earth. Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. He simply watched it, as the stem slowly began to pull itself upright against the stillness. Elias turned away from the patch of earth, his legs heavy, moving with a stiff, mechanical gait. The trek to the mountain spring felt longer than ever. Every step was a negotiation with his own exhaustion, his joints locking and protesting the movement. He reached the spring and submerged the bucket. He lifted it, the weight pulling at his sore shoulders, and began the slow walk back, halfway across the valley floor, his vision blurred. He stumbled, his knee hitting the hard ground, and he braced himself against the bucket to keep from spilling a single drop. He stayed there for a moment, head bowed, until the dizziness subsided. He pushed himself up and finished the journey, his pace steadying. He reached the sprout and knelt, his movements careful and deliberate. He tilted the bucket, letting the water trickle out in a thin, controlled stream. The liquid vanished instantly into the parched, thirsty ground. He watched the soil darken, his eyes locked on the tiny, bent stem. A second leaf unfurled, delicate and vibrant against the gray dust. Elias sat back on his heels, his breath shallow, watching the new growth. Elias shifted his weight, settling into the dry earth. He did not leave. The valley floor cooled rapidly as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, leaving the world in a deep, bruised purple. He pulled his knees to his chest, his eyes never leaving the two small leaves. The silence of the night was absolute, broken only by the occasional settling of stones or the faint, dry rustle of the wind against the parched ground. He watched the sprout. It remained still, a tiny, defiant speck of life in a landscape of dust. Hours bled into one another. The stars traced slow, cold arcs across the sky. And still, he remained, a silent sentinel in the dark. He felt the chill seep into his bones, but he did not move to seek warmth. His focus was singular, anchored entirely to the fragile green life before him. As the deepest part of the night passed, the horizon began to bleed a faint, pale gray. Elias watched the light creep across the valley floor, inch by inch, turning the gray dust into a field of soft, muted gold. He did not blink. He did not look away. The first sliver of the sun crested the mountain ridge, casting a long, sharp shadow behind the sprout. The light hit the leaves, illuminating the veins within them, turning the pale green into a brilliant, translucent emerald. The heat began to return to the valley, but the sprout stood firm. Elias exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried away the exhaustion. He remained there, fixed and steady,